Hello, everybody. Sorry, if sorry we are late. We're 4 minutes late, and I had a few computer problems since last week. My system got corrupted, and I had to reinstall. Did I mention this? I think I mentioned this on Thursday. I was just recovering from that, wasn't I? Then on Mike's live stream, but I've managed to get everything set up again now. So hopefully it's all working well. So thank you again to Shannon and Karis for joining me today. Let's check. Yeah, I'm sorry, this has got the wrong camera. I'm just going to change my camera so that I'm now looking like that. Yeah, that's better, isn't it? So I'll have to change this each one we go through. But not been a lot of news apart from my computer problems at this end. Incredibly busy trying to get a judicial review off the ground for tomorrow. Um, It's that thing we were talking about. Do you remember we were talking about a judgment that had come in that it was so long nobody had time to read it, and it was all about when you could make another application and whether it had to be exactly the same facts. So I won't be betraying any confidence if I just outline it. That the client was refused an offer of accommodation, a very, very common problem. Refused an offer of accommodation 2 years ago, and slowly things move along that there's an unsuccessful review of the suitability of the accommodation and then an unsuccessful appeal. And on the, it was probably lawfully, if not morally, acceptable. But problem is, people don't realise that when they refuse it, they think they'll just get another offer, or they don't realise how serious the consequences are. So then they take possession proceedings for the temporary accommodation. They get a possession order, and then a bailiff's warrant comes through. Now, my understanding of the law is, and I may be proved wrong on this, is that if you've got, particularly if you've got a child living with you and you've become homeless because your temporary accommodation was cancelled because of something that happened 2 years ago, the council need to process a fresh application from you and consider what duty is owed to you now. The tendency of the council is to say no to that. Say, what are you doing back here? We told you, we've discharged our duties towards you. But my understanding is that if you, in order to access the secondary duties, you need to be found to be intentionally homeless. That's to say, the duty to provide you with assistance under Section 190 in obtaining accommodation, which is available to people who are intentionally homeless and in priority need, and also, well, you could get assistance under the Children Act in any event, but the duty under 190 seems to be limited to people who are intentionally homeless. So anyway, this client applies to the council, actually goes there in person and is told you can't come in. I think this is a very common post-COVID experience. I'd be interested if anybody else has had the same problem. But you go to the council office, you get stopped by some security person who says, no, you can't come in. You have to either you have to make an appointment or you have to do this online. Now, back in the days before COVID, the one of the reassuring things I think we've said about homeless applications was that you could, if you reached the sort of end of the line and you were homeless, you could go into the council's office, and at least there was somewhere you could sit with your things and wait for somebody to see you. It may be sometimes you got seen at 5:25 when somebody popped out and gave you a negative Section 184 notice. But at least you got processed. But now you go online, you don't hear anything. So anyway, chasing the council up, get a message Thursday afternoon. Sorry, and the eviction's due for tomorrow, Tuesday. Message saying sorry, not going to help you because we've cheated our duties as discharged. And I've sent them a pre-action letter for the judicial review pre-action protocol, but they've come back and said no. The same person that wrote the email saying we're not going to help you because we discharged our duties then wrote another one saying the same thing but in longer. And they were saying that it's there has to be a sort of change. I think they confuse breaking the chain of intentional homelessness with making a fresh application. and you don't have to show that you've had settled accommodation and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, that's been a big stressful thing. So I'll hopefully have some good news on that one next week. But the difficulty, just in practical terms, is like finding a barrister to work on judicial review cases, because if you send messages around on a Friday night saying anyone do any work with a view to issuing on Tuesday, it's almost impossible. I mean, I managed to approach somebody directly, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to go through their clerks, but all the clerks tend to do, and I may be unfair here, but they just send an email around saying anyone want this case, but they don't chase it up and impress on people the urgency of it. So that's that one. So I haven't got a lot else to talk about today. There was a couple of stories in the news I thought I might touch on. But was there anything? I think I asked you before, so I won't go through the motions again. But neither of you two have any specific issues you want to rant about, or uh, okay. So I just see if we oops. I just see if we got any comments out here. But I'll go back to here. I haven't learned the way to because if I go onto this screen, you get to see this screen, don't you? That says this is the placeholder, which is not supposed to have. That's supposed to be invisible, but and one of these days it will be. I'll just go to the comments section on here. I flatter myself that people are watching and there are comments, because I didn't put the notification up on YouTube that this was going live until late in the day today. So, I've got a couple of. Oh, in fact, I thought I got two comments, but one of them's you.
Sorry, Will, I didn't.
No,
Yeah,
that's all right.
I was trying to increase the reach by commenting
No,
back. You see, and
that's
like
good.
saying hi to good old Cheeseface.
But we got Cheeseface. Hello, Cheeseface. Thank you very much for your greetings. And anybody else out there want to say hello or ask any questions? Now's the time to do it. What I will do is I'll keep an eye on comments coming in, and I'll talk about this case. See it, and I'll be able to demonstrate that I'm getting better at sharing my browser now, which has been a problem in recent weeks. So now, if I go to this screen here, you should see this BBC story I thought people might be interested in, which is very much a sign of the times. I'm just going to have a sip of tea, sorry. And the headline is "Woman stuck for 18 months on an NHS." You can read it too. On an NHS ward, evicted from her hospital bed. So things had finally reached a stage by the time of this, just before this story, where, having been in hospital for 18 months, the hospital actually evicted her, which it raises a number of interesting or important issues. Interesting is a bit of a callous term when you're talking about a human being getting evicted from a hospital, but important issues. Number one is, what do hospitals do when people don't leave when they're ready to be discharged? They can ask them nicely to leave, but I suppose they could try and sort of trick them into leaving, and then change. The things are gone when they come back. But if they're staying put, then you can't really go up and just yank people out of their beds, because for one thing, that would be a criminal assault if you use force on someone. And it goes against the whole spirit of hospital, the way in which people engage with people. They're supposed to be sort of caring for them. And I think the hospital staff here knew that this lady had mental health problems, which compounded the physical health problems that had led to her admission. So it says that 35-year-old Jessie spent 550 days at the hospital. For nearly all that time, she was medically fit to leave, but the problem was finding her somewhere to go that was suitable. And it gets more complicated, because they only managed to find her one place that was suitable, that they thought was suitable, and she didn't think it was suitable. Now, she does seem to have had solicitors acting. It says she's got an advocate. There was an advocacy organisation. I won't go through the whole story. I mean, it's there if you want to read it on the website. but there was an advocacy agency, but they stopped acting for her because they said she stopped communicating with them. And let me just go back to that. She was assessed as having mental capacity. See, there's the problem. So you don't, once you've been assessed as lacking capacity, it becomes slightly more favourable for you, because they'd have to go to the Court of Protection to get an order to move you, probably. So she's got capacity, although she was assessed as needing a professional advocate to support her. She gets referred to the advocacy firm by the council, but then, by the council, but then her case is closed after she asked for a new advocate and didn't respond. Now, I don't know whether that, I'm surprised the BBC would refer to solicitors as an advocacy firm, but maybe they are. But it seems odd she doesn't have a solicitor involved in the process here. And also it seems, I mean, I guess not everybody in this situation lacks capacity, but it does seem like she doesn't have capacity to engage with the system that she's dealing with here. But I'll assume she does have capacity, and therefore she's deemed to be able to deal with this without a litigation friend or the Court of Protection being involved. And so they can just move her. So the actual mechanism for moving her seems that she was arrested. So the police come, because they would presumably say there's an order, you've got to leave, and if you don't, you're in contempt of court, and then you can be arrested. I suppose they could have asked the bailiffs to come and evict her. You know, they could have asked the High Court bailiffs to come, but there must be a reason why they chose the police. So let's just go to the end of the story to see where she's ended up. But presumably they've put her in the place where she's recently been visited by a new advocate. That's the last bit. So that's good news. Yeah, so 10 days after the hearing and 18 months after she arrived in hospital, the police arrested her. She spent several hours at a police station before being moved to the flat. So she said she couldn't take the place that they said was suitable because it had bad memories, which could mean a lot more than just, well, it sounds a bit vague there. But so, I mean, the key issue in this case, I think, is that it shows just how starved of resources the system is, in that there was only one place that could be offered to her, and that was something she didn't think was suitable. I suppose people who are unsympathetic to people in this lady's position might say, well, you know, she's just been difficult. She's got to cooperate and recognise that it's an emergency service, and it's not just about what she wants, but it seems here that I think everybody concerned would agree that it's unsatisfactory that they just couldn't find something suitable for her. And I think we're probably going to see, I mean, maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg of things that are already happening. And that the only thing that's notable about this story is that a journalist got hold of it. It's probably happening all around the place without that. But I guess without knowing more about the actual legal issues, I can't really say much more than I have. So it's very unfortunate. And I hope it highlights the need for the government to invest more in the care services and resources for people in need of specialist or with special housing needs. I had a case last week. Somebody was in court for council claiming possession of their home for antisocial behaviour, and it was largely based on the applicant's son. And he was accused of, it was alleged that he behaved in an antisocial way towards neighbours and things. But she pointed out in the course of talking to her, it was somebody else's case that I was just standing in on briefly. But she mentioned that he's 19 now, the son, and he's never been in anything other than temporary accommodation. And you think, well, how disruptive that is. And it's another sign of just things not getting, things just getting worse and worse. So I'll just go back to the comments. If you guys want to do jump in if you want to say anything about that.
I think for me, like, and look, obviously I know Northampton have sort of like declined to comment because it's like a ongoing legal case. So my thoughts are not with the whole information. So I'll just acknowledge that now. But I
Yeah,
think from because I've just skimmed it, but I think the BBC picked up on it because they did a similar article a couple of months ago, and loads of people got in contact saying that they had similar experiences. And for me, like, it's really, maybe it's not that interesting, but for me it is. Like, they mentioned the Care Act and like the mental capacity assessment and stuff, but there's no mention of like the duty to refer or a homeless application or anything apart from like the eviction stuff in regards to homelessness. And I find it a bit frustrating that the BBC, which is such, a go-to source for information and stuff, isn't sort of, if as a sector, a homelessness sector, we're supposed to be multi-agency working and looking at different legal ways to help people. If the BBC isn't picking up on that and getting that out there, like, I wonder whether actually this person does have capacity but is just really trying to exercise their legal rights, and whether it was the housing department who has perhaps gatekept them and then left the NHS in a bad place. And so the NHS is getting the sort of like hate for kicking out this woman out of a hospital bed, but actually, once again, it could be, and look, I could be completely wrong. Northampton Council could have been doing absolutely everything spot on. I think it's North Northants, isn't it? But I just, like, the BBC haven't gone to the housing department for comment, for example, or anything like that. And I think we're talking about suitability of accommodation and homelessness essentially. Like, was the duty to refer made? Why didn't it get followed through? Why wasn't there, a personalised housing plan? What did that look like? Like, there's no mention of,
no, you're quite right.
my mind, there's no mention of anything homelessness lawry. There's not even sort of an acknowledgement that she's homeless legally, but just that she's got nowhere to go. And I know that seems like such a really small, like, it's a wording issue, but I think the BBC has so much power on how they're wording these things. It's like cases where there's like sexual assault and everything else. Sometimes the way they word it sort of lowers the seriousness of it, and lowers sort of actually the other possibilities and the other failures and the other pain points where services could have jumped in and helped. And I think the advocacy service was probably a mental health advocacy service or a health advocacy service. Or am I repeating on myself?
No, you're not.
Audio wise, I can hear myself back.
Oh,
I'm going to stop talking, and yeah.
Oh, that's something I wanted to ask. If anybody out there hears echo, please let me know, because Karis and I did a sound check earlier, and we were getting some bad echo, and then just before we came live, we got really bad echo. But I thought I'd sorted that. But the problem is, you sound fine to me. Uh-oh, I think we just lost. Maybe Shannon's rejoining.
We lost our head.
But anyway, the problem is we can't tell at this end while we're talking to each other whether there's echo. It's only people who are listening to the stream that can hear the echo. So please say if you notice any. I'll just wait and see if Karis comes back. There you are. You're back. Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear us? Oh, are you muted?
Is my audio better?
Oh no, that's fine. Do you want to say
perfect.
something and
Sorry,
see if you can
carry
hear
on,
some
Karis.
echo? Try doing a sound check.
I can't hear any echo when I hear myself speak now, so I think
Good.
I'm fine. But sorry, Karis, because you were going to say something.
I was just going to second the duty to refer, because this is where they said she stayed in hospital because there was no suitable place for her, but then they arrested her and took her to a care home. So where does one suddenly become available just because the police turn in? And how does it escalate that far? Yeah, that's quite interesting. That the police have to get involved to evict someone when they should have been, where's the human dignity in transitioning her to a new placement, whether it's her own house or supported house or to the care home. But the police are taking her when that's not a medical, you know.
No. Well, I suppose what's presumably happened is the police have actually been charged with the sort of role of removing her from the hospital. That's sort of short-term priority number one. And then they take her to the police station, and then they say, well, look, here's the place you can go to. And if you don't want to go there, well, it's not our problem. So that I'm assuming that's how it worked. But I tell you what, I think Shannon, you've raised a really interesting point there about news coverage of this type of story. Because it says Karis is now echoing. Oh dear,
Right.
because Cheeseface gave us a clean bill of health. So. Yeah, it says Karis is now echo. Oh dear. Do you want to say something else, Karis, just to check if that's still going on?
Hello. I was going to say I'll stop talking now.
Well, okay, but just for a minute. But maybe it'll be okay next time. But I think that there's an element of so often when I watch things on the BBC, and I don't want to sound like some sort of anti-license fee, sort of abolish the BBC type of person, but I do find I hardly watch the BBC as a TV station anymore, if you call it TV. And I don't really. I mean, I find that I do read their news app, but I do find it a little bit frustrating. But I grew up as a kid watching Blue Peter. And I tend to find that sort of has formed a model for so much of what the BBC's output is, that it's very, very sort of patronising and lightweight. So it's sort of like a thing about the legal system is little more than sort of the day I went to court with my school sort of thing. And this type of story, as you say, it raises complex legal issues. Which, I mean, one of the stories is that there are laws there to protect people and they're not working, but we don't even get close to that from, this is all done on a sort of, I mean, somebody from the BBC or even the journalist who's responsible for this, which is, there's two, there's Adam Ely and Alison Holt, one of whom is the social affairs editor, unless they are jointly. So they're looking at it as a social, but I think law comes under social, doesn't it? Really, I mean, but then if you have someone like, is it Joshua Rosenberg, who's been the BBC legal correspondent for years? If he is, it all tends to be done in a very sort of dry way. But there's very little news about sort of social welfare law. The law tends to be when sort of Jeffrey Archer's getting sued or David Beckham's doing a libel case or something. Unless
You've got the WAG trial.
Yeah, the WAG trial, yeah.
That's what I get involved.
That gets more coverage. Whereas what's really interesting here is that you're seeing a sort of welfare state that has got legal foundations and legal framework just breaking down. And that, I suppose that brings us on to the other story here, which I was going to comment on from the BBC website, which again, I think is a little bit superficial and not looking at the legal issues, which is headed up billionaires own my mouldy rental property, which I mean, I think that's a little bit like sort of Freddie Starr ate my hamster, isn't it? A bit, and that it's not the issue of. I mean, you can make a sort of sensational headline out of billionaires. I mean, billionaires presumably own loads of rental properties, and that you get companies and individuals. But again, the story here is the story of these folk here who've lived in a house. They've got mold. It's mold on the walls, and there's a child affected by it. And it's to us, I'm afraid, it's all familiar. I mean, even to people watching the BBC, it's presumably familiar stuff. Oh no, we're getting the message. Charlotte's just put a message up saying there's a bad echo again. Could you just say, am I echoing, or is it just the others? Because if it's me as well, I'm really sorry. It means we're all suffering from it. I'm going to have to spend the next week researching this.
I can't hear an echo from you.
I beg your pardon?
You're not echoing for me.
No, you're not echoing for me either, but I think it's only if you're outside of this little loop that we're in. And if we were listening to a recording of this, we'd hear it. But I guess, I mean, if anybody, I don't think anybody from the BBC is watching this, but I think it would be really good to get the BBC, I mean, to sort of encourage journalists to take a more daring dive into the law and say why isn't this working?
I think with this one, what annoys me, and perhaps I'm being unfair, and like, look, I'm also not saying. I'm not saying anything, guys. Like, don't take what I'm saying. But like, the headline and everything else is like blaming the millionaire landlord. Which, look, moralistically, do I necessarily agree with that? Probably not. But let's ignore that and put that to one side for a minute. We're blaming this like billionaire landlord instead of again looking at the system failures and going, it's not just this one landlord that, you know, we've seen this, and they mention Awab Ishak in there. They mention like the fact that that law has been sort of slowed down and halted and stuff, but they've not mentioned that this isn't one landlord. This isn't even 3 landlords, 5 landlords. Like, this is a system issue. This is a homelessness issue. This is a housing issue. This is, you know, how we're treating people in our society. And actually, I think, again, I feel like I'm being really pedantic, but those headlines cause real issues because as a society, we then blame individuals and we go, there's nothing we can do about that. Like, what can I do about a billionaire landlord? Absolutely nothing. But what could I do about systemic changes? Well, actually, I could do a damn lot. Like, I can go to my local housing committee. I can do, you know, FOIs. I can do whatever it might be. I can write letters. I can do petitions. I can influence. I can involve lived experience. All these different ways to influence. But that headline completely negates any power we have within community and within society to sort of tackle these issues. And I think that's the same on a professional level. It's giving professionals an out, and it's giving everyone an out. And we just go, oh, these faceless, nameless millionaire landlords, like, yeah, they're a problem, but like, they're not the actual problem. They're like a pseudo problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, you can have a million landlord who is brilliant and your house is, you know, immaculate in great condition and there's no mold and what have you. And I think, have I made sense there?
No, you do. You do. I think we're sort of saying almost the same thing, really, aren't we? That they're concentrating on more trivial aspects of the story rather than the systemic ones, and also systemic in terms of how widespread the problem is, but also systemic in the sense that there is supposed to be a system in place to prevent this, and that system is breaking down or being neglected. If I just hang on, I keep doing this by camera. Goes to that one. That's
And
better.
it's also making them a scapegoat, like you said. You're scapegoating and making it target someone. And look, it's their problem when it's not. It's actually everyone should have done something.
And if that brings us on to another thing that Karis and I were just discussing before that we started today, which is the introduction of AWAB's law, which is again, I suppose it is fashionable now to name laws after usually often children victims of social problems that give rise to the law, but maybe in a way sort of obscure what the actual law is about, because. But this law is supposed to come into force. I think that yes, it's going to be from October. Social landlords are going to be forced to investigate and fix dangerous damp and mold in set time periods and repair all emergency hazards within 24 hours. Which I was saying to Karis before, this reminds me of the thing we were talking about with the Homelessness Prevention Act, that after many years of cutting local government resources, funding, the government then introduces a Homelessness Reduction Act, which, if you look at it in the sense that I'm looking at it, it increases the responsibilities of local housing officers or housing options, whatever they're called now, many fold and turns them into almost like housing advisors like us. Because if they're doing their job properly, they ought to be assessing people's needs, and looking to make sure they get not just accommodation that's suitable, but support as well. Now after many years of cuts, it really is a bit like saying to them, "Well, pick up your bed and walk," because they haven't got the means to do it. And when you take this AWAB's law, I mean, how on earth? I mean, it does beg the question as well that many of the problems that we're dealing with are private landlords, and it's not the billionaires necessarily. It could be the person who's got one property that they rent out, and it's just unfortunately they can't afford to maintain it very well. So it seems they may be exempt from this anyway, because it says social landlords are forced to investigate. I haven't studied this law, I must confess. But the point is, again, you don't really need a new law, I don't think, because there's been laws in place. There's the Housing Act 2004, which sets out a number of hazards which all landlords are supposed to address, and local authorities are supposed to enforce this. But I think that even by 2004, or when that act came into effect, the local authority involved what used to be called environmental health departments, and I say used to be called that because they sort of withered on the vine over the years. They used to enforce these things, and now there's it's impossible. It's almost impossible to get them to do anything. So if rather than inject funds into getting them to do what they should be doing, and they've come up with a new law, which, I mean, I'll be interested to see how it goes. But my experience of the big social landlords in London, that's to say like Peabody Trusts, London and Quadrant, Southern Housing, Poplar Harker, I mean, they are absolutely dreadful. I mean, in private, they'd probably be the first to admit it. Absolutely dreadful on these issues. They're so much mold and damp. How they're going to deal with them in 24 hours or within set time periods, and who's going to be monitoring this? I mean, there's nobody at the council to do it. And what do you do if they don't do it? Do you get the director of London and Quadrant sort of sent to the Tower of London or something? It all seems very strange to me. Sorry, that was quite a long.
No, but and
babble.
again, I think you're right, and I think again, and like I'm not saying Awab's law shouldn't exist, or those processes shouldn't be in place, but I have yet to see years later any mention of the fact that they made a homeless application to the local authority. They gave them reason to believe they were homeless and asked for help with their housing. And it's the same in this woman's case on the BBC. She's approached the local authority, give them reason to believe that she's homeless and asked for help. That's a homeless application. If the local authority was doing their job and not gatekeeping, they would have recognised that they were homeless because of the huge impact on their health, because this person's got COPD, it's a child, and everything else, and would have gone through Part 7. And the Part 7 solution might be to get the landlord to fix up and to make adaptations to the property and put them in TA in the meantime. So it might not have been like, they had to provide a main housing duty and everything else, but we're again just missing. It's not that it shouldn't exist, but it kind of feels like we've got another law in place, which is brilliant, but we're sort of just weakening and watering down the law that does exist. And like the Housing Act isn't bad, right? Like it's not as great as it could be, but in this case it would have saved his family. Like it would have saved Awab Ishak if they'd housed him. Like I'm sure of it. And it's just frustrating to see once again there's no link there between. And we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about housing. I don't understand how the housing ombudsman is dealing with all of this, and there's no acknowledgement that they could have made a homeless application. I don't get it. These are experts working on this, aren't they?
Well, you think so, wouldn't you? But it seems everybody's sort of in their particular ivory towers, and nobody's joining the dots. And we'll have to see where it goes. I actually did. Sorry, go on, Karis.
Like you said, one of the parts of the new law is supposed to give tenants that empowerment, But we've seen people make complaints, go to the ombudsman, they've come out the other side and nothing, and they haven't had any repairs or any impactful change with those complaints that are in place. So how would this make any difference to that procedure? I wouldn't.
I can't see that it will necessarily, unless, I mean, it begs this question of, if social landlords are going to be forced to investigate and deal with things, I mean, forced is quite a strong word there. I mean, does that mean that the sort of police are going to go around to their offices if they're not doing it? And
Yeah.
I mean, on a serious level, maybe that's what they should be doing, because they're putting people's lives at risk. And if they were driving around over the limit in their cars, they'd get into trouble. But they seem to be able to. I mean, it seems ridiculous to suggest that they would be doing that. But then the other thing to bear in mind is, it comes back to the post office inquiry, which to me is a sort of sign of the times par excellence. It just shows how broken the system is. But one of the problems with the post office was that you get these management, particularly that Paula Venables, who's maybe been, not even victimized, but she's sort of held out as the sort of personal example of everything that's wrong. But these people with ridiculously high salaries, who are sort of treated like minor royals, go around in sort of designer suits going to meetings. And it's the same in the housing associations. If you see the salaries that the chief executives of these housing associations are getting, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's not like they've sort of gone to number one in the charts or something. They're just doing a job running a housing association. But I think the whole thing ought to be sort of radically shaken up, and that these should be seen as having a social public function, which they should be held criminally responsible for. I mean,
But that's the point. When people die from effect of their illness, like if they linked Arab's death to the damp and mold, and the children that have died in temporary accommodation, where does corporate manslaughter? I'm involved, or
well, that's what you're into.
Under that. Yeah.
I've always thought corporate, when you talk about corporate manslaughter and companies, I mean, it always seems to be a bit of a sort of unreal exercise, doesn't it? Because you can't really do anything with an organization. You can take money off it, but I mean, it'll close down and another one will open. But at the end of the day, you do need, I mean, it remains to be seen how many people get criminal convictions for what they've done at the post office.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would hope that there'll be the people I've seen interviewed in that inquiry, there's some of them there that I think definitely. I don't know if prisons. I don't really believe in prison unless it's absolutely necessary to protect the public from somebody who's a dangerous threat. I think that just but that you could make them do things like community service, or I don't know. But anyway, that's another question of sort of crime and punishment and sentencing. But they should definitely face sanction, I think. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But I just wish they'd think that they have tools in place to deal with this. And the problem is that the tools are broken, but they could fix them rather than just put in new ones, which seem doomed to fail. I mean, this whole thing seems doomed to fail to me, because unless you're going to give some organization's going to need a lot of resources to carry out the enforcement function. And there's also going to have to be some tough sanctions. Otherwise, enforcement's just a slap on the wrist and nobody bothers paying attention to it. So if I stop, I'll come back on this subject again. But I'm just finding that the most common problem that we've got, I'd say, as solicitors at the moment in London, because you can sort of break the cases down into categories of case that come up. Like the most common case that comes up at the moment is a pattern of somebody that's been placed, they've applied as homeless, and they've been given, a duty's been accepted, and they've been placed in accommodation, which is not just unsuitable for a number of reasons. It could be a long way away, or it could be, other things. But it's almost, not almost always, but in these situations, there's a huge number of them that are just in a very bad condition, and they're either in a bad condition as soon as you move in, or within a few weeks of getting there, the damp and the mold comes out, and you've got a private landlord who isn't responding, or worse still, an agency. There's some really dodgy agencies out there that sort of
Yeah.
manage these things, and then you've got a local authority that sort of wants to. In fact, I'll continue. I had a case in court last week, believe it or not, where we were trying to get a family rehoused because of the damp and the mold, and we said that they're homeless, even though you've provided them with accommodation, they're homeless. And the council said no, they're not, for whatever legal reasons. But we actually had the landlord came to court as well to say yes, I would never have rented to this family if I'd known how big the family is, and it's just unsuitable, and there's damp and mold everywhere. But it would be interesting to see well, unfortunately, given our marvellous court system, we were all went there for a 1 day trial, but there wasn't enough judges, so we all had to go away. But one day we'll go back. But that's the most common problem we have. So what we have to do straight away is do a letter to the council requesting a suitability review, or threatening a judicial review if it's 188 accommodation, and then a pre-action protocol letter to the landlord about the disrepair. And this is almost sort of just doing sort of, I think, 1 or 2 of those a week at the moment, which is a small tip of the iceberg. But if I may move on, I've got some comment. I've got a comment here from Anthony. We've got actually a question, which we'll try and answer. And thank you for putting it in the third person. I didn't give the warning that Mike always gives at the beginning. But if a person has signed a contract for 6 months, can the person give notice if they want to leave the property earlier than the 6 months? I hear that it's 2 months' notice, but don't know if that's right or not. That is quite a common problem, which lawyers often get asked. I think I know the answer. Do you guys want to say anything about it, or shall I dive in? I'll just dive in and say what I think. That if you sign a fixed term contract, say for 6 months, then you are obliged to stay. Well, you're liable to pay the rent until the end of 6 months. If you give notice, the landlord's entitled to say, well, you're not entitled to give notice yet because it's a fixed term, and the fixed term hasn't expired. So you can leave if you want, but you're still liable to pay me the rent which you've agreed to pay every month for the fixed term. There's a couple of ways around that. One is you could find another tenant for the landlord, and as long as that was a reasonable, a sort of suitable person, it would be difficult for the landlord to complain. But what they would be able to do, say for instance, if you if you moved in after 2 weeks and decided you wanted to go, and it wasn't the landlord's fault. Let's say you got offered a job on the other side of the country and you wanted to go, the landlord would be entitled to say, well, I'm not willing to let you out of the contract, and so I'm going to hold you liable. And that would be a contractual thing. There's nothing to do with particularly with landlord and tenant, or it's just any tenant. If you make an agreement with somebody to pay them monthly for 6 months, then you're obliged to do that. But there are ways around it. For instance, if you found another tenant for them and said, look, I'm afraid I've got to go, but my friend here who's got impeccable credentials and lots of references would like to take over the tenancy, and the landlord says, no, I'm not going to accept that. I want to make you responsible. The legal term for that is the landlord has failed to mitigate their loss. So it's a bit like if somebody ran you over in their car and you then decided to get up and try and walk home, and you made your injuries much worse, the landlord would be responsible up to a point, but there comes a point where you've made things worse. And that's what the court would be saying here, is that the landlord can't sue you necessarily because they had the opportunity to continue to receive their money but unreasonably refused to accept the alternative tenant. Another alternative is if you could Sorry, to go back to the specifics of the question, there's no 2-month requirement here. I think the 2 months notice comes from the statutory requirement for 2 months notice for a notice of seeking possession, such as the Section 21 notice is usually 2 months, isn't it? Or is it? I think it. Yeah, I'm sort of losing my memory there. What you could do is so there's the notice to quit. You can give the notice to quit as a tenant once the fixed terms expired. You could say, right, I'm leaving, or you should, if you're polite, when the 6 months is coming to an end, you should say, oh, by the way, I'm planning to leave. If you want to start advertising, now's the time to do it. But once you get to the end of the 6 months, you could just say, okay, 6 months is up, I'm off. But if you continued to stay there, the landlord couldn't say, I'm coming round to change the locks tomorrow, you've got to leave, you only stay for 6 months, because they'd have to serve a notice in the normal way, and you would then be what's called a periodic tenant. But I won't go into that because you haven't asked about it. But the other thing you could do during that initial 6 months is you could invite the landlord to accept a surrender of the tenancy, which is a voluntary arrangement whereby it goes back to sort of medieval concepts of law where you're in possession and you say, I'll surrender, and you can have your place back. And so you invite the landlord to surrender. And the usual way of doing that is say, may I give you the keys back and not pay the rent anymore? And if the landlord says, yeah, that's all right, because I've got other people that would like to rent this place, then that's fine. You're out of the tenancy. You haven't served a notice, but the landlord has accepted a surrender. You have to offer the surrender. They have to accept it. You can't just say, I'm surrendering the tenancy. I've left the keys at the office, because that hasn't been accepted. So if you do that, make sure you get the acceptance in writing, because if something falls through with the new tenant, they may come after you and not remember that they'd had verbally agreed that. So I hope that's answered the question. You can voluntarily get out of the contract during the 6 months, or you can try and voluntarily either by agreeing a surrender or getting a new tenant to be taken over. But other than that, you're stuck, really, I think. But please, anybody out there, as usual, anytime I say something, I don't hold myself out as the sort of authority on these things, and I'm happy to learn from being corrected. And if I may, I'll just bring. I think that we've got a few more questions coming in on this. Sorry, guys, if you want to jump in on anything, do. But I'll just go because Anthony's asked that question, and Cheeseface has made another point which may be related to this one. The problem with temp accommodation, in my experience, is that it seems to attract people who have properties on their last legs. The homeowners still want to make money, so then rent them to the agencies. Yeah, that's true. Or even worse, it could be people who are quite cynical and thinking, well, hang on, if I buy a house that's run down and convert it into flats, and I spend X amount of money doing a really rubbish job of it, but just enough to get past the council, I can then get the council to enter into one of these sort of we'll pay your rent whatever happens agreements, and it's a nice little earner maybe. So yeah, there's a lot of bad faith involved, and then a big selling point being councils pay 6 weeks rent in advance. Yeah, I didn't know that they did that actually, but thank you. It says to squeeze more life out of the properties rather than fix them and rent them out for normal, much higher than local housing allowance price. Yeah, I mean that's another problem, is people decide they can make more money. I don't know if I mentioned this, I think it still happens, that one of the real downsides for landlords is that councils can reclaim housing benefit, or they could do when I was doing benefits, that if it turns out the tenant was wrongly getting benefits, the landlord's in a mess, because they can reclaim all benefits paid directly to the landlord by the council, which could be thousands. But that's not that sounds like I'm sticking up for landlords. I'm not. I'm just saying you've got to be quite a hard sort of person to be doing this thing and renting out privately, because nice people, once they've been burnt with that, they probably don't want to get involved. So you're really dealing with sort of people who are gambling on making a quick buck.
Also, I guess just one small thing to add. I know we've got more questions coming in, but on the first question around sort of leaving earlier when you're earlier than your tenancy runs out. I think, like, we deal so much with like when it doesn't work out right, but like I know from like personal experience, actually, I got really poorly, ended up losing my job, and was like, I explained all of that to the estate agents. Well, look, I know I'm still in contract. Is there anything? And they were like, yep, no, completely understand. We'd rather you be honest now and us end the contract so you're not in arrears and everything else, and we're not chasing you for money and wasting our resources. And actually, they made an exception. So depending on circumstances, having that sort of conversation, it could still lead to potentially a good outcome. They might ask for 2 months' notice and say, look, give us 2 months to re-advertise, to get the place up, and for you to move your stuff out and stuff. But I just, yeah, I feel like I had a negative rant earlier, so I was like trying to be a bit more positive
No,
about this
thank you
one.
for that, because I think I was being ultra sort of, I was just in sort of litigation mode and thinking what, but there are actually human beings involved here who could actually be perfectly nice about it. And if they've got a nice, I mean, at the end of the day, if a landlord's got a decent property, the demand for it at the moment means they should only really have to sort of put an advert out, and it should be taken. They're not going to have any trouble reletting the place. So you're quite right. You should let them know, and then hopefully you can reach arrangement. So I've got a question from Mo here. My friend is fleeing domestic violence. Their UC job centre is saying either a social worker or the council have to send information in writing in order to be exempt from the shared accommodation rate. There's a bit more. Is this legally correct or necessary? Do you want to? Is that something you know about, Shannon? The
Probably know more than you guys, but
yeah.
I think in this case, actually, it is necessary. I think because it's universal credit and it's to do with the housing rate. Though no, actually, one sec. The UC. No, see, I don't. Oh, sorry, ignore me. So the shared accommodation rate for settled accommodation, not for temporary accommodation, because temporary accommodation would be through housing benefit, not through universal credit. Right. So yeah, they would need a letter just as confirmation, but if it's the fact that the person doesn't want to sort of disclose domestic abuse to the job centre, which is obviously absolutely fine, then they could ask the local authority to just say that they're exempt from the shared accommodation rate. They don't necessarily have to disclose that they're sort of a survivor of domestic abuse. Though if they did, there are often specialised workers in job centres that focus on sort of domestic abuse. But I do think the letter is sort of necessary just because it's so for their systems to put you to make that exception essentially.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's a follow up, isn't there? Or is that a separate question?
Hang on a sec. You're faster than me. I was. There's the one about somebody being referred for an autism assessment, but I'll just check because I was just searching. I was just googling, and I can show you what I came up with by pressing this button here. So again, the problem with googling at the moment these days now is you get the initial answer. I don't know if you guys find this, but you get an artificial intelligence answer, which I'm not 100% sure of, but it doesn't often they don't really quote the source. But here, I think if we go down here, there's some guidance, which is from the, and it gets, you go from the very vague to the amazingly specific. If I go to here, because what the links below this page led me to was the housing benefit and universal credit victims of domestic abuse and victims of modern slavery amendment regulations. Now, somewhere in here, and if my official, you've got to get somebody in their official capacity. Yeah, there we go. And that says at paragraph 7.11, victims of domestic abuse will be required to provide written evidence from a person acting in their official capacity that their circumstances are consistent with those of a victim of domestic abuse, and they have made contact with the said person in relation to such an incident. So I think that answers the question, Mo's question, is this legally correct? I think it is. I mean, there's a couple of legal questions I would have as to quite what an official capacity is. and what sort of officials you're talking about. I mean, obviously, if I appointed myself as the sort of people's mayor of Lewisham, um, said I was acting in an official capacity, I guess that would get turned down. But then again, it could be, would a local, I don't know, would your local vicar be, I mean, that might be somebody official.
I think it has to be like a worker that you're working with around
Okay.
us, so like
Like an IDVA
or an IDVA or
Okay.
someone who knows about the situation and could talk to it. At least when I've worked with people in this situation, it's been often it's the housing options officer, because there's no reason for them not to do it. Like, it's not necessarily a thing that the council would be like, we don't want to do that.
Because presumably the purpose here is to stop people. I mean, it'd be the easiest. It's like, I remember I got my mobile phone stolen once, and I went to the police station to report it, and there was a queue of people who looked like they were there to report mobile phones being stolen, and there was a big sign above the desk saying anyone making false claims, because if you basically want to upgrade your phone, that's how you did it in those days. I don't know if you still do, but the danger is from the benefits agencies, I suppose, that somebody's audited them and said, well, hang on a minute, anyone who doesn't like this shared accommodation rate can just say, oh yeah, I'm a victim of domestic abuse. I don't say that in a sarcastic voice there intentionally, but that's how it would be perceived. But then again, it's not that difficult, because all you got to do is go to somebody official. I mean, they don't have to witness the violence, do they? They just say, Will came to see me and said he'd been subject to domestic abuse, and then they would write a letter, and that letter would meet. Just this raises opportunity for me to ask what may be a really stupid question, but I've never had to ask it before. Is how do you get an IDVA? I mean, what's the easiest way for somebody out there who wants to get a letter? Because presumably you could go to the council and say, "Can you help me? I'm homeless because I've suffered domestic abuse." But what is there a particular route you take? Do you think that you go to MASH or something? Or
I think it depends on your local area, because I think some areas it's easier to get an IDVA than others. So some areas, if you've gone to the hospital, for example, and it might be like a domestic abuse situation or they suspect it, you might be allocated an IDVA. For some people, it's if you go to like the local women's centre, or if you go to the local authority, they'll do automatic referral. I think some places you might be able to self-refer, but don't quote me on it. But yeah, I think it's normally a referral system. Often they'll then do like the dash form and everything with you. But I think it's either self-referral in some areas or it's only professional referral. I've known it to be like professional referrals mainly. I think you can potentially ask the local authority for one as well. But again, don't quote me on that. I'm less
nowadays,
confident on that
getting
side.
through to local authorities half the battle. I mean, it's just finding somebody that says something other than computer says no, really, isn't it? And the so the police, you could go to. I mean, oh yeah, one question as well. Do you think that domestic abuse, as it's used in that term that's on the screen there at 7.11, is that the new modern sense of domestic abuse, which means a lot more than, I mean, again, back in the early 90s when I was doing this, you literally had to walk around with a black eye before people sort of treated it seriously. But now it's extended to the point where if somebody's controlling or,
Coercive.
yeah. So a lot of that stuff is stuff you wouldn't, if you went to the police and said sort of, my family they keep taunting me about something which I'm finding sort of, it would bring you within the definition. They'd probably, well, they probably wouldn't call it, I mean, I don't know, they might not refer you to somebody.
There's emotional abuse and everything else. I think they would.
Yeah.
It's now that huge understanding.
And I think it's, without trying to open up a whole can of worms, but I think the problem isn't the level of abuse that's not being believed. It's women in particular and men not being believed. I'm echoing again, sorry guys.
You can tell if you're echoing. Oh, right, okay. So what is the so it's problems of people not being believed, or just generally? Um, yeah, it's okay. Well, I guess the thing is, just to go back to my question, I suppose the answer I've got is that you just go to any you could go to a doctor or the local police or the council and just ask somebody. And I guess actually schools might be a common place to get referrals on, because they got close ties to social services. Because I mean, if they see people, obviously children with bruises and things, so they must also be aware of parents who turn up at the school looking like they're with evidence of abuse. So that would be a good thing. So anyway, most people probably know how to contact sort of access to a help agency. So I hope that answers the question. Now it's 8:35, so I'll keep it quick. I'm sorry, time sort of zoomed along, so I'll just go back to this question here. Oh, we've done that one. It's this question here. It's about, my friend has been referred to an autism assessment and possibly an ADHD assessment too from the GP. The GP has said the waiting list to be seen for an autism assessment is 2.5 years. Do you know any private place to get an autism assessment and bypass the 2.5 year waiting list with NHS funding? I think could a GP and police statement suffice for him? I don't know if that overlaps with the first question there, Mo. Oh, you mean? I mean, I don't know if the GP the GP could make a statement about autism, but I'll just come back I'll just go through all the threads of your question and then try and answer it. They were told professional referral from a social worker, email or council officer, but they would never inquired yet if GP or police documents would suffice. I'm sorry, Mo, I may have lost you a bit there, because I'm assuming that you've been asking those questions about the first question while I've been waffling away about the answer. I'm sorry I didn't get back to you sooner, but just very quickly on that, a professional referral from a social worker, email, or council officer email. They never inquired yet if police or GP. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess you could. Well, the way to try and find out, I suppose, is to get documents from the GP or the police and find out if they suffice. But and if they don't, then I mean, you could hedge your bets and try and approach the council. But just to go back to the autism question.
Sorry,
Shannon.
I don't think it would suffice.
Okay.
Because they could comment on the domestic abuse, but they can't comment on the housing benefit like system and structure and stuff. So they wouldn't necessarily say like, oh, because of the domestic abuse, you're now entitled to this like benefit adjustment, essentially, because they're not a professional in that capacity. They might be a professional on the domestic abuse side of things, but not. Does that make sense? It's not someone verifying the domestic abuse, it's verifying the eligibility for the housing adjustment, I think.
Okay, it's that
I'm not saying don't try it, but I would go to a social worker.
Wishing to drag things on longer and to seem argumentative, this wording here doesn't seem to. It just seems to be somebody officials saying that they have consulted them about circumstances consistent with those of a victim of domestic abuse, and they have made contact with the said person in relation to such an incident. So it sounds like it'd be worth having a try, wouldn't it? And but I'm not wishing to challenge what you said there, but I mean, you know more about it than me. But so the best thing is to try.
Not at all. It's worth it. Like, go for it.
Well, presumably doctors. I mean, doctors and people. My problem with social. I mean, you'd think it wouldn't be that difficult. Say, well, okay, let's get a social worker. But the problem is trying to get a social worker. I mean, they're just so underfunded nowadays. That trying to get them. I mean, I got an assessment report from Adult Social Services once with Adult Social Services on a case, and I've been threatening them with legal action to get this assessment. I don't know what it's going to, how good it's going to be. I haven't read it yet, but it's taken me about a year to get this. But there's always all sorts of excuses as to why it's not necessary. But anyway, go back to this quickly. Yeah. So the question is there? I mean, I'm not aware of any service out there providing assessments of autism or related conditions for free, effectively, on the NHS in a short time. having said that, Mo, I don't know what the need for the assessment is, because that could be relevant. So that if you needed it for legal purposes, then the legal aid agency may well pay the costs of getting an expert, and that can get you can get a report very quickly, well, much quicker than 2 years or 2.5 years. I mean, it could take 3 months, but that's a lot quicker. And also, if people are told that there's an assessment in the pipeline, they might sort of hold off doing things that they might otherwise have done. So yeah, that's the only sort I'm aware of. I don't know if anybody else is aware of anything, but the NHS, as far as I'm aware, is the only funder that would, unless you go to charities or something, but I don't know of any. Any ideas?
I'm not sure of any. I've heard sort of horror stories of people getting a private diagnosis and then it not being accepted by NHS doctors. But what I would say, if it's in relation to a housing or homelessness case, then a housing officer I could imagine say, well, we need a diagnosis and we need, this and this. But actually you could potentially ask for a Care Act assessment and just focus on the symptoms of the autism and ADHD and how it's affecting you, because that still counts as a disability. Like under the Equality Act, it doesn't say you have to have a diagnosis. It's just what affects you on a day-to-day living. So I would potentially try and get a Care Act assessment, and maybe like another assessment of needs or something from a GP, and say, look, actually, I've told you all of these different things. I appreciate I'm being referred. Could you do something that just highlights the different sort of, whether that's sensory overload or anxiety or whatever it might be, all the different things that this person might be struggling with, that might have an impact on their housing or homelessness. If that, makes sense.
It does. So that's good. There's an additional one, is the Care Act assessment, but the trouble with Care Act assessments is, like I say, is just getting hold of people that have local authorities that have the resources to carry them out. And it's just very difficult to get through to people. But I think that unless anybody's got any other questions or points to raise,
I would just add, you have with autism especially and mental health, you have the right to choose your healthcare provider, and that's an option that's often not spoken about a lot, which is, especially when you're doing your assessment and things, you have the right to choose someone that you can work with and you work well with and you get on with, and that can see you in a reasonable time.
I didn't know that. Have you come across that sort of people trying to enforce that?
Yeah, sometimes it works. And sometimes the mental health professionals will be really good and they'll work with someone and they'll aim to keep it consistent. So they'll work with someone consistently. And if they say, no, we don't want to move the person, if it's severe mental health, particularly local connection, that's worked before, staying with that provider.
Thank you for that. I'll have to talk to you more about that. The other thing I was just going to mention before we go is, and maybe I didn't know about this at all, and it's been enforced for 24 years now, which is the, oops, I'll just get rid of this comment and then you can see what I'm showing you. Is it this, not this one, sorry, that one I think. There's another one. Let's just get rid of that altogether if I can. I'll just get rid of the comment. Actually, I think I can do like that. Oh no, sorry. What I'm trying to do is get back to the this. I know what I'll do. I'll jump to this one. There's this thing called the Autism Act 2009, which is here. And this is just I just did a Google search for Autism Act, and I keep meaning to do more research on this because it's not something I've used or heard of people using, but it's basically saying that the Act places a duty on government to have an autism strategy and a strategy guidance for local authorities and the NHS to improve services for autistic adults. And so it may be that the fact that we haven't heard anything about it means that it sort of has, it's got exceptions to it, which means that it's not really enforceable in real life. But it could be that it's an underused weapon that people haven't come across yet. But that is, so one of these days I will get around to finding out more about that, and I'll let you know when I do. But anything else anyone wants to add? Otherwise, I'll wind up for this evening and hopefully see everybody again on Thursday, when I think all three of us should be on Mike's channel. Oh, I shouldn't. I meant to say, sorry, Mike couldn't be with us tonight because he's been training out of London and travelling. So sadly, I think it's the first time Mike hasn't been around for one of these. So hopefully we'll all be back reunited on Thursday. So thanks, Shannon and Karis. I really appreciate you giving up your evening and dealing with these technological issues. And I hope the echo wasn't too bad in the end for everybody out there. But please let me know if anyone's listening and they hear it, because I will. I mean, I'll assume now that it's okay, and I'll just focus on tidying up other aspects of the presentation. So good night for now, and see you all again soon. Bye bye.